A fat tourist brazenly stuck his middle finger right in the guard's face, expecting complete silence. But suddenly, a thunderous roar shattered the air. Panicking, he stumbled back, tripped over his own feet, and crashed to the ground, becoming the laughingstock of the entire crowd. But this was only the beginning. Buckingham Palace gleamed in the sunlight, its pristine white walls glowing against the backdrop of a clear blue sky. Crowds of tourists roamed in front of the massive gates, snapping photos on their phones and cameras, whispering in awe as they gazed at the British guards, motionless, majestic, like living statues. The guards stood tall, as if carved from stone, clad in red tunics and towering bearskin hats. They were the embodiment of honor, discipline, and an unshakable tradition, unaffected by the noise and chaos surrounding them. But that day, order and tradition clashed with pure American arrogance and drunken audacity. At the center of it all was Danny Wallace, a massive, sweaty, red-faced American in his 40s. He swayed slightly on his feet, his broad shoulders and protruding belly barely contained by a tight white tank top that looked ready to burst at the seams. His short American flag-patterned shorts stretched over his thick thighs, and in his hand, he clutched a half-empty plastic cup of beer. The London heat and several pints of ale had taken their toll. Danny's face was flushed, sweaty, and slightly puffy. His eyes darted around the crowd before landing on one of the guards. "No way! They just stand there all day?" He scoffed loudly, taking another swig of beer. Beside him, his friend Brandon snickered. He was slightly quieter, but just as drunk. A scrawny man with greasy blonde hair plastered to his sweaty forehead and dark sunglasses that he refused to take off, despite the overcast sky. "Yeah, pretty much," he giggled, lazily picking at his teeth. "They don't move unless you touch them." Danny smirked, staring at the guard like a child who had just found a new toy. Before him stood a British guard, tall, fit, with sharp, aristocratic features. His posture was flawless, his face expressionless, his body completely still, an image of absolute discipline. His red uniform was crisp and immaculate. His massive black bearskin hat made him look even more imposing, and his hands firmly gripped a rifle with a gleaming bayonet. To Danny, this was bizarre, incomprehensible. How could someone just stand there? No reaction? No response? He glanced at Brandon, grinned, and took a step forward. The crowd fell silent. Some had already pulled out their phones, anticipating a show. And then, Danny stuck up his middle finger, right in the guard's face. The crowd gasped. People whispered, some chuckled nervously, others lifted their cameras, sensing something about to unfold. But Danny wasn't done yet. The crowd froze. The air grew heavy, tension hanging over the square in front of Buckingham Palace. People stopped taking photos, their fingers hovering over camera buttons as they held their breath. No one expected anything to change. After all, the guards never move. They are trained for this: stoicism, discipline, absolute resistance to any outside distractions. But then, something unbelievable happened. The guard took a deep breath, his chest rising ever so slightly beneath his perfectly pressed red tunic. It was an almost imperceptible movement, but against the backdrop of his absolute stillness, it felt like a thunderclap in a silent sky. Danny didn't notice. He didn't care. He kept grinning, leaning in even closer, his hot, beer-soaked breath washing over the motionless soldier's face. And then, "Back off!" The voice shattered the air like a cannon blast. It wasn't just a shout. It was a command, thunderous, authoritative, drilled into perfection through years of military training and countless battlefield orders. The crowd flinched. People recoiled in shock. Some instinctively ducked, shielding their heads. Someone screamed. A tourist dropped their phone, the device clattering onto the pavement. For most, it was just a sudden outburst. For Danny, it was a sonic explosion straight to his soul. His body reacted before his brain could even process what had happened. His eyes widened. His mouth hung open. His already flushed face turned an even deeper shade of red. And then, his body betrayed him. The moment of humiliation. His thick legs tangled beneath him. Danny was not a man of great coordination, especially not after several pints of beer. His right foot slipped on the damp cobblestone, still wet from spilled drinks. His left leg buckled. His arms flailed wildly, desperately grasping for balance. It was a slow-motion disaster. He tilted backward, his beer cup flying out of his hand, sending the last of its warm, sticky contents into the air. "Oh, crap! He's going down!" someone yelled. And within seconds, thud! His massive body crashed onto the pavement, his gut bouncing from the impact, his head shaking from the force. Sticky beer splashed all over his face and chest, soaking his once white tank top. Some of it even dribbled into his ears, mixing with his sweat to create a disgusting, sticky mask over his face. For a moment, time froze. And then, the crowd exploded into laughter. The crowd's reaction. "Oh my God, he wiped out!" someone cackled. "That was legendary," a man shouted, snapping photos like he was at a war zone. "I thought the guards don't react," a woman howled, practically collapsing into her friend's shoulder from laughter. "Yo, did anyone get that on video? That has to go online." The crowd was losing it. People pointed at him, some trying to get the best camera angle, others already uploading clips with captions like, "When you try to troll a guard but your own ass betrays you." Danny loses face. Lying flat on his back, Danny groaned, his entire body trembling from a mix of shock, pain, and utter humiliation. His brain struggled to catch up. 1 second, he was laughing in triumph at the guard. The next, he was sprawled on the ground, drenched in beer in front of hundreds of people. He wanted to joke. He wanted to entertain the crowd. He wanted to get a reaction out of that damn statue. Instead, he became the joke himself. His shirt was soaked, his hair was sticky with beer, and his ass ached from the hard stone pavement. And the worst part? He looked up, and the guard was motionless again, as if nothing had happened, as if there wasn't a drunk American lying in a puddle of his own failure. The crowd was still laughing when Danny, red as a boiled lobster, jerked himself upright, barely keeping his balance. His massive body shook with anger. His face had turned an even deeper shade of crimson, and his chest heaved with heavy breaths. He looked less furious and more like a man drowning in the humiliation of his own failure, drunk, embarrassed, and fuming. "What the hell are you yelling for?" he shouted, his voice shaky as he gasped for air. It was loud, but it cracked, like someone who had no real argument but was desperate to have one anyway. "You can't just scare people like that." The crowd roared even louder. Someone snorted through their laughter. "Oh, sure. And you have the right to be an idiot?" Danny whipped his head toward the hecklers, but quickly refocused on the guard. But the guard did not move. Not a single muscle twitched. Not a single expression changed. He had once again become part of the palace's unshakable stillness, as if he hadn't just unleashed a thunderous command that sent a grown man flying backward onto the pavement. Danny threw up a hand, waving it aggressively in front of the guard's face, desperate to get some reaction. Nothing. No blink, no flinch, no change in posture. The crowd lost it. "Dude, he's literally a statue!" someone yelled, cackling. Danny flailed his arms drunkenly, feeling the last shred of control slip through his fingers. The crowd was mocking him. The guard was ignoring him. And he himself felt small, stupid, ridiculous. And that's when something unexpected happened. When you think you've lost, but it's only just beginning. The guard moved. It was lightning fast. A sharp, military-precise pivot. In a single fluid motion, his gleaming black boot lifted into the air. And then, thud! He slammed it down onto the cobblestone with a force that echoed across the entire square. This wasn't a regular step. This was a disciplined, commanding, battle-ready stomp. The crowd gasped. Some even flinched. But the most shocking reaction? Danny's face. His eyes bulged. His breath caught in his throat. His entire body jerked backward as if he weren't looking at a man, but at a war machine activated for destruction. And then, he did what he did best. The second fall. Even funnier than the first. His own legs betrayed him again. The fat American stumbled backward, his body not built for quick reactions. His heels skidded against the stone. His arms flailed like a cartoon character losing balance, and with a guttural, panicked yelp, thud! He crashed onto his ass. Again, this time even harder. The crowd went wild. 2 times! He fell twice! This is gold! Oh, dude, you're done. This is already online. Phones waved in the air, screens glowing as people recorded from every possible angle. Somewhere in the crowd, a young woman was already uploading the clip to TikTok with the caption, "When the Royal Guard reminds you who's boss." But this time the laughter started to fade, because now it wasn't just a funny accident anymore. Something else was happening. The end game approaches. 2 men stepped forward from the crowd. They weren't tourists. They weren't laughing. They were security. One was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a black suit, an earpiece in his ear, his face stone-cold serious. The other, a uniformed British police officer, light-skinned, stocky, dressed in a navy uniform and high-visibility yellow vest, holding a radio in one hand, his expression dark and unamused. They walked with purpose, and they were heading straight for Danny. The crowd started whispering. Someone clapped, excited for the grand finale. Danny, still stunned from his second fall, didn't immediately realize what was happening. He rubbed his sore backside, groaning, and then he saw 2 pairs of heavy boots right in front of his face. Slowly, he looked up, and then he understood. He was in real trouble now. The crowd quieted down, laughter fading into curious anticipation. Everyone had watched this fat American humiliate himself twice, but now it was clear. The show was reaching its grand finale. 2 men stepped out from the crowd. The first, a tall, broad-shouldered black security officer, dressed in a sharp black suit, an earpiece in his ear, walking with the calm authority of someone used to dealing with drunken troublemakers. The second, a stocky, light-skinned British police officer, clad in a dark uniform with a high-visibility yellow vest, a radio clipped to his chest. He wasn't tall, but his cold, steel-eyed stare carried the weight of experience. He had seen it all, from petty thieves on Oxford Street to drunken riots after football matches. They weren't in a hurry. They moved with that classic British composure, the kind that made their approach feel even more inevitable. And they were heading straight for Danny. The first blow to his ego. Danny was still struggling to get up, his thick arms pushing against the pavement, his legs trembling from a mix of exhaustion and alcohol. He barely kept his balance, his beer-soaked tank top clinging to his sweaty belly, his face contorted in a mix of pain, frustration, and pure confusion. The police officer studied him for a moment, then spoke. "Get up." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, absolute. Danny blinked, his drunken brain struggling to process what was happening. What? For what? The officer let out the smallest sigh, like he had heard this 1,000 times before. "You've disturbed the public order." The crowd murmured, whispers spreading, but most people just watched with undisguised fascination. Brandon's last attempt. "Oh, come on, you're kidding, right?" A voice suddenly cut through the moment. Brandon. He had been standing off to the side, watching it all unfold, but now he stepped forward, arms outstretched, trying to shield his friend. "It was just a joke. He didn't touch anyone." The officer's head snapped toward him, his stare turning sharp as a blade. Brandon froze, his face paling as he realized this was not a fight he wanted to pick. Without another word, he stepped back, hands raised in surrender. Danny's final excuses. Danny was panicking now. "That guard scared me," he suddenly shouted, flailing his arms, desperately trying to win the crowd over. "Can he even do that? Is that allowed?" The crowd burst into laughter. People exchanged amused glances, some openly filming his pathetic performance. The police officer chuckled, shaking his head. "The guard is protecting his post." He paused, then added, "You, on the other hand, are just a drunk idiot." The crowd erupted. "Oh my God, that was brutal!" "Officer just ended this man's whole career. This is history." Danny's face collapsed into pure defeat. His hands flew to his head, his eyes darting around, his already red face somehow turning even redder. And then, under his breath, he muttered, "Oh, dude, I'm so screwed." The officer leaned down, his voice calm, collected, and ice-cold. "You have no idea." Click. The handcuffs snapped shut. The next morning, a national sensation. By morning, headlines across the UK exploded with the viral sensation. Every major media outlet, from The Guardian and BBC to tabloids like The Sun and Daily Mail, ran the story, turning it into a nationwide spectacle. And in every news broadcast, in every online segment, one video played on repeat: a fat American flipping off a royal guard, a thunderous command, a panicked reaction. The first fall, frantic arm-waving, a threatening stomp from the guard. The second, even more ridiculous fall, handcuffs snapping shut. Every moment was analyzed, memed, and mocked across satirical talk shows and online forums. Headlines you couldn't escape. American tourist tries to taunt royal guard. Ends up humiliating himself twice. Drunk tourist wanted to be funny. Now he's famous for all the wrong reasons. From cocky to catastrophic, the double fall that became a meme. The video spread like wildfire. TikTok, millions of views within hours. Reddit, an entire thread with tens of thousands of comments dissecting every second. Twitter's our sex, users ruthlessly roasting him, calling it American arrogance in action. But for Danny, the worst part wasn't the internet. It was what happened next. The real punishment. The next day, Danny stood in a British courtroom. The air was tense, formal. A judge in a black robe and powdered wig peered down at him. This disheveled, humiliated American, looking as if he had just crawled out of a dumpster of disgrace. The verdict came swift and brutal. Guilty of disturbing public order. Danny's head dropped. His shoulders slumped under the weight of reality. Then came the final blow. Banned from entering the United Kingdom for 5 years. His mouth fell open. This wasn't what he expected. He came to have fun. To film a cool video for his friends. And now, he was officially exiled from the country. A few quiet chuckles echoed through the courtroom, one of the journalists smirking at the irony of it all. The final nail in his reputation's coffin. The moment he stepped out of the courthouse, he was swarmed by reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones were shoved in his face. He looked wrecked. Dark circles under his eyes, slumped posture. The last shreds of his confidence sucked out of him. He muttered, staring blankly into a camera lens, as if hoping this was still a joke. As if he would wake up any second and realize it was all just a drunken nightmare. I thought I could make him move. The reporters smirked. One of them glanced at his colleagues, then turned back and hit him with the final, brutal question. So, do they move? The crowd erupted in laughter, and in that moment, Danny knew his story had become a lesson.